Eleanor Keegan was 18 and homeless. No family willing to take her in, no savings to speak of. Just a worn canvas backpack and 10 pounds sterling she'd been hiding in an old biscuit tin under her bed at the care home. And with that 10 pounds, she bought an abandoned stone church sitting on 3 acres of overgrown green field in County Cork, Ireland, in a valley so remote that the nearest town was 7 miles away, and the nearest neighbor was a man named Declan who lived in a cottage that couldn't be seen from the road. The roof had holes the size of dinner plates. The stained glass windows were either shattered or missing. The Church of the Holy Redeemer had been decommissioned in 1987, closed by the diocese because the congregation had dwindled to 7 elderly people and the expense of maintaining the building had become impossible. But what nobody knew was that hidden in the bell tower, sealed inside a copper box that had been placed there in 1952 by a man nobody remembered anymore, was something that would transform her entire life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Eleanor had been moving towards stone and solitude her whole life without realizing it. She was born in Dublin to a mother named Catherine and a father named Michael, both of whom struggled with addiction in ways that made them unable to be parents. Her mother left first when Eleanor was 3, just disappeared one Tuesday morning and never came back. Her father tried for a few more years. He held a job as a mechanic for almost 18 months, which was a record for him. He showed up to Eleanor's school events sometimes. He made her breakfast once in a while, usually just toast with jam and tea. But the pull of the drink was stronger than the pull of fatherhood, and by the time Eleanor was 8, her father had handed her over to her grandmother, Sheila, a hard woman with soft hands who raised Eleanor in a small terraced house in Cork City, where the rain fell sideways and the streets smelled like salt and fish in the Atlantic wind. Sheila worked as a cleaner in the cathedral. She would leave before dawn and come home after dark, her hands raw from the lye soap and her back bent from years of scrubbing. She left money for Eleanor's supper on the kitchen table and told her to be good and stay out of trouble. Sheila was not unkind, but she was tired in a way that made affection difficult. She had raised 3 children of her own, and now she was raising a 4th. She did what she could. Eleanor learned to be independent early. She learned to make her own tea and toast. She learned to do her own washing. She learned to sit quietly and not ask for things. She learned that love, when it came, was usually expressed through action rather than words. Sheila would mend Eleanor's school uniform without being asked. She would leave her favorite biscuits on the pantry shelf. She would sit beside her in the dark and listen to her breathing on the nights when Eleanor couldn't sleep. By the time Eleanor was 12, she understood that her grandmother was aging. Her movements were slower. Her hands shook on cold mornings. The house, which had always been clean, began to show signs of neglect. A stain on the ceiling that got bigger with each rain. A corner of the kitchen where mold was growing on the grout. Eleanor started helping more. She scrubbed the floors. She climbed the ladder and wiped the... Sheila lived for another 2 months. She died on a Sunday morning in April, with the rain hitting the hospital windows and Eleanor sleeping in a chair beside her bed. Eleanor was 14 years old, and suddenly completely alone. There was no family to claim her. Her father was somewhere in Dublin, if he was anywhere at all. Her mother was a ghost. There were cousins, distant ones, who sent a card to the funeral, but made no offer to take her in. The state took her then, and the state put her in a group home in Cork City with 7 other teenagers who were also unwanted, unloved, in the way that children become invisible when there's no one to see them. The home was run by a woman named Margaret Hayes, who had been doing the work for 30 years and had learned not to get attached. She fed them, she clothed them, she enrolled them in school, she made sure they attended, but there was no warmth in any of it. The home smelled like boiled cabbage and industrial cleaner. The rooms were shared, 4 to a bedroom. The food was cheap and filling and without flavor. Eleanor survived it by becoming quiet, by being the kind of girl that nobody noticed, by doing her chores without complaint and keeping her bed neat and her possessions organized. She went to school and did her work and came home and read books in the corner of the living room where no one bothered her. At 16, Eleanor got a job at a library on Oliver Plunkett Street, shelving books and helping patrons find what they were looking for. The librarian was an older woman named Fiona O'Neill, who had worked at the library for 40 years and who understood without being told that Eleanor was a girl who was carrying something heavy. Fiona didn't ask questions. She just made sure Eleanor had a hot cup of tea on her break and left her extra sandwiches on the back counter when she thought no one was looking. Fiona taught her how the library was organized, not just the Dewey Decimal System, though she learned that too, but the way a library was a kind of sanctuary, how the architecture of a building could create peace, how high ceilings and quiet spaces and the smell of old paper could heal something in a person that nothing else could touch. Eleanor would stand in the stacks and run her fingers along the spines of the books and feel something settle inside her chest. She started reading voraciously, architecture books mostly, books about medieval cathedrals and Romanesque churches and the history of sacred spaces. She read about buttresses and flying arches and the way stone could be shaped to hold up the weight of human prayer. She read about the builders, the craftsmen whose names nobody remembered, who had put their whole lives into creating spaces where people could sit and feel connected to something larger than themselves. She began to understand that buildings were a kind of text, that you could read them the way you read books, that they told stories about the people who had built them and the people who had loved them. On her 17th birthday, Eleanor found herself in the back section of the library, in front of a book about abandoned Irish churches. She sat on the floor for 3 hours, reading about buildings that had been left to rot, churches whose congregations had migrated to cities, churches whose doors had been locked and keys thrown away, churches that stood empty in the Irish countryside, holding centuries of silence inside their stone walls. Something in her recognized something in those photographs, a kind of loneliness that felt familiar, a kind of waiting. She started saving money. She worked extra shifts at the library. She took on cleaning jobs in the evenings. She refused the small allowance the state gave her. She kept the money. She spent those 2 weeks researching. She looked at auctions. She found websites listing decommissioned churches and religious buildings. Most were expensive, hundreds of thousands of pounds. Restoration projects for wealthy people with time and money and a romantic notion of what it might mean to own a church. But then she found a listing for the Church of the Holy Redeemer in County Cork, listed by the local council. Condition: poor. Asking price? £10. It was a joke listing, she realized. It was the kind of thing they posted knowing that nobody would actually take it seriously. A building so far gone that its value had become a kind of insult. They would accept £10 just to get it off their hands, just to have someone, anyone, willing to take responsibility for it. Eleanor read everything she could find about the church. It had been built in 1847, during the famine, by a man named Father Donnell O'Rourke, who had used his own inheritance to construct a place of worship for the community that was starving around him. He had brought in stonemasons from Cork City. They had worked for 2 years, building walls from limestone quarried in the valley itself. They had installed hand-carved wooden doors and commissioned stained glass windows from Dublin. The church had stood for 140 years as the spiritual center of the valley. And then, gradually, the community had emptied. Young people moved to Dublin, to America, to Australia, to anywhere that promised work and a future. The elderly died. The congregation shrank. By 1987, there were 7 people left, and the diocese decided the cost of maintaining a building for 7 people was unsustainable. The church had been empty for 31 years. Eleanor took the bus from Cork City on a morning in May. It was a journey that took nearly 3 hours, with several transfers, heading deeper and deeper into the countryside, until the road became narrower and the fields became wilder, and the sky seemed to get bigger. She got off at a crossroads where a man with a dog was waiting for the same bus going the opposite direction. She asked him how to get to the Church of the Holy Redeemer. He looked at her for a long moment, as if she'd asked him something in a language he didn't quite understand. "Why would you be wanting to go there?" he asked. "I'm going to buy it," Eleanor said. The man smiled, but not unkindly. "Are you now? Well, it's a mile down that road, then left at the oak tree, then another mile through the valley. You'll know it when you see it. Big stone building, been fallen down for 30 years. Eleanor walked. The road was narrow and green-bordered, with hedgerows thick with hawthorn and wild roses. The sky was the color of wet cement, threatening rain. She could hear a river somewhere, running fast from recent rains in the mountains. The valley, when she reached it, opened up before her like a... It was smaller than she'd expected, maybe 60 feet long, with a steep peaked roof and a bell tower rising from the far end. The stone was gray-green, stained by rain and moss. The windows were mostly broken, some boarded, some just open to the sky. The door hung partially open on rusted hinges. But even in its decay, there was something noble about it, something that had survived. The way it sat in the landscape, it seemed less like a building and more like a living thing that had endured for a very long time. Eleanor approached slowly. She pushed the door open further and stepped inside. The interior was vast and empty. The floor was stone, worn smooth by 100 years of footsteps. The walls rose up into shadow. Wooden pews were stacked haphazardly against one wall, their seats rotted and fallen. The altar was still there, a simple wooden table with a stone cross mounted behind it. Above, the ceiling was partly open to the sky, rain coming through in places, creating dark stains on the stone. Birds had nested in the rafters. Weeds had forced their way up through cracks in the floor. Graffiti marred some of the interior walls, the work of teenagers who had used the empty church as a place to explore and leave their marks. But there was light. Even through the broken windows and the holes in the roof, there was light coming through. And in that light, Eleanor could see what the church had been. She could feel the presence of all the people who had sat in these pews, all the prayers that had been said in this space, all the hope and fear and faith that had accumulated in the stone over the decades. She walked to the bell tower and climbed the narrow stone stairs. They spiraled upward, worn and uneven. At the top was the bell itself, a massive bronze structure suspended from wooden beams. The bell was covered in bird droppings and the accumulation of decades. Around it, hanging from the rafters, were bird nests and the debris of years. Below the bell, on a wooden shelf built into the stone wall, was a copper box. Eleanor lifted it carefully. It was heavy and sealed with solder and age. She could see there was writing on the top, but it was so tarnished she couldn't read it clearly. She took the box carefully down the stairs and into the main church, where the light was better. The writing said, "For whoever comes next, 1952, Father Donnell O'Rourke." Eleanor sat on the stone floor in the middle of the abandoned church and looked at the box in her hands. She didn't open it yet. She just sat with it, feeling the weight of it, understanding that someone, 70 years ago, had put something in this box and hidden it, believing that someday someone would need it, someone would come. And she, Eleanor Keegan, homeless 18-year-old girl with nothing and no one, had been found. She opened it carefully, trying not to damage it further. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were rolled up papers. Beside them was an envelope, sealed and addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." She opened the envelope first. Inside was a letter, written in careful, old-fashioned script. "To whoever reads this, my name is Father Donnell O'Rourke. I built this church in 1847 with money I inherited from my mother. I built it because the community needed a place to gather, a place to believe that their lives meant something, that their suffering had purpose. I have served in this church for 55 years. I am now 83 years old, and I know that I will not live much longer. I can see the future. And in that future, this church will be empty. The young people will leave. The old people will die. The diocese will eventually close it, and the building will fall to ruin. But I cannot accept that everything we built here will simply disappear. So I have hidden this box. These papers are the deeds to the land this church sits on. 3 acres, free and clear. I have also hidden money. Not much. I was never a wealthy man. But enough to make a start. Enough to rebuild what has fallen. Whoever you are, whoever finds this, you came here for a reason. Maybe you needed shelter. Maybe you needed to believe that beauty could exist. Maybe you needed to know that someone, decades before you were born, was thinking of you. Thinking of someone like you. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Then she unfolded the papers. They were indeed deeds, official documents, the title to 3 acres of land and the building that sat upon it. And beneath the papers was a cloth bag, heavy with the weight of coins and folded notes. She counted them slowly in the light coming through the broken windows. The total was 4,370 pounds sterling. More money than she had ever seen. More money than she had ever imagined owning. She sat in that church for hours as the afternoon light changed and the wind came up and the rain began to fall through the holes in the roof. She cried then, the kind of crying that comes from years of holding everything in. She cried for her mother, who had abandoned her, for her father, who had been too broken to stay, for her grandmother, who had loved her in the only way she knew how, for all the lonely nights in the group home, for all the years of feeling unwanted and invisible. And she cried for Father Donnell, who had thought of her 70 years before she was born and had left her everything he had. The council made it official the next day. Eleanor signed the papers in a small office in the nearest town. A woman named Bridget, who worked for the council, processed the sale with a look of amusement and skepticism. £10 for an abandoned church seemed like a joke to her. But the paperwork was in order, the deeds were legitimate, and the property legally became Eleanor's. She spent the first week living in the church, in the shelter of the bell tower, with her sleeping bag and her backpack, and the knowledge that she owned something, that she had a place, that she belonged somewhere, finally. She mapped out the repairs that would need to be done. The roof was the first priority. The walls could wait. The windows could wait. But the roof had to be sealed before the winter rain made things worse. She worked with a local mason named Podrick, a man in his 60s whose own farm was struggling and who was glad for the work. They started with the worst sections of the roof. They stripped away the damaged slate and removed the rotted wooden beams beneath. Podrick showed her how to assess what could be salvaged and what needed replacing, how to set new slate, how to make sure the pitch was right so water would run off properly. Eleanor worked alongside him, learning everything she could. Her hands blistered, her muscles ached. But slowly, section by section, the roof became whole again. By the end of summer, the main roof was sealed. By autumn, she had replaced the windows in the clerestory. By winter, she had cleaned out the interior, carefully removing the damaged pews and salvaging the wood that could be reused. She had found a young carpenter named Seamus, who worked for beer money and the satisfaction of seeing something beautiful come back to life. Together, they began to restore the interior. The people of the valley came to help. A woman named Bridget brought tea and sandwiches. A farmer named Liam donated stone and labor. An electrician named Thomas came out on weekends to figure out how to safely wire the building. None of them asked why she was doing this. They just seemed to understand that this was something that needed doing, and that Eleanor was the one who needed to do it. By the time a year had passed, the church was transformed. The roof was solid. The windows were restored. The floor was clean. The walls had been repointed. Eleanor had built a small living space in the old sacristy, with a bed and a wood stove and shelves for her few possessions. She had restored the wooden doors, sanding and oiling them until they were beautiful again. She had carefully cleaned the stone cross at the altar. On the anniversary of the day she had found the church, Eleanor stood in the bell tower and held the letter from Father Donnell in her hands. She had read it so many times she could recite it from memory. She had cried over it and laughed over it, and felt with each reading the weight of what it meant. That someone had thought of her, that someone had left her something not just material, but spiritual. A place to belong, a purpose. She opened the bell tower door and looked out over the valley. The fields were green, even in late May, under the Irish sky. She could see the cottages scattered across the landscape. She could see the road leading away toward the town. And she could see the river, glinting in the afternoon light, running through the valley the way it had run for centuries. Eleanor Keegan was 18 years old when she became homeless. She had £10 to her name, and she spent it on an abandoned church in County Cork. It was the best £10 she ever spent. She spent the next year restoring it, and the next 5 years making it into something more. She opened the church to the community. She held coffee gatherings on Sunday mornings. She started a small library in the side chapel, a collection of the books she loved, available for anyone in the valley to borrow. She hosted weddings and funerals and birthday celebrations. She made it a place where people came when they needed to feel held by something larger than themselves. The isolation she had always craved became connection. The loneliness that had shaped her became the foundation for community. The broken building became whole, and in the process of making the building whole, Eleanor became whole too. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell us in the comments, what is the oldest building in your area, and what story do you think it holds? We'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one.